I was standing in the kitchen holding a pen that weighed like lead in my trembling hands when I heard the words that would change everything forever. Go away. Sarah, you don't belong in this family anymore. Richard's voice echoed through the 2-story house in Westchester, New York, where we'd built 23 years of marriage, where we'd raised our 2 children, where I believed I'd found my forever. The smell of coffee still warm in the machine mingled with the expensive perfume of Jennifer, the platinum blonde woman who sat at my kitchen table as if she owned the house. My kitchen, my table, my life being torn apart before my eyes. The paper in front of me was a pre-drafted separation agreement, with details only someone who knew every corner of our financial life could have crafted. Richard stood there, impeccably suited, at 7 in the morning on a random Tuesday in October, as if he were heading to another business meeting at his law firm. Only this time, his goal was to destroy me completely. Jennifer smiled when our eyes met, a cruel smile that revealed perfectly straight teeth and a sadistic satisfaction that made my stomach churn. She wore a red dress that cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months, and her perfectly manicured nails tapped against the oak table I had chosen 15 years ago. You have until the end of the week to sign, Richard said, his voice cold and calculating, completely different from the man who whispered sweet nothings in my ear during our late-night lovemaking. If you don't sign, I'll sue you for abandonment and make sure you don't get a penny of our estate. The sound of rain began to pound against the kitchen's picture windows, as if the sky itself were weeping over my plight. I could smell the wet lawn mingling with the artificial scent of Jennifer's perfume, creating a nauseating combination that made me want to vomit. Jennifer rose from her chair with studied elegance, approaching Richard like a snake approaching its prey. She placed her hand on his arm, a possessive gesture that made it clear she wasn't there by chance. Richard told me about your depression, Sarah, she said, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. Maybe it's best if you seek professional help away from here. The children will understand. The children. Emma, 19, was in college in Boston, studying medicine as she'd always dreamed. Michael, 16, was a senior in high school, captain of the football team, with a scholarship practically guaranteed. They knew nothing about Jennifer. They didn't know that their father had decided to trade 23 years of marriage for a woman 15 years his junior. The clock on the wall read 7:20 in the morning, and I remember thinking how surreal it was that my life was being torn apart during business hours. Richard glanced at the Rolex on his wrist, a gift I'd given him for our 10th wedding anniversary, back when we still believed love was forever. I have a meeting at 8, he said, as if he were talking about the weather. Jennifer, can you show Sarah where to sign? The casualness with which he spoke about our separation, as if it were just another contract to be signed, made me realize that this man was no longer the Richard I'd married in the small Methodist church in Connecticut. Jennifer took the pen from my hand with a false kindness that made me feel nauseous. I'll help you with that, she said, pointing to the lines where I was to sign my own social and financial death warrant. The paper was divided into sections, detailing the division of assets, child custody, and alimony, or rather the lack thereof. According to the document, I would leave the marriage with just $10,000 in my car, a 2018 Honda Civic that was already starting to give me trouble. Richard would get the house, the investment accounts, the 2 rental properties we'd bought together, and the vacation home on Cape Cod. It was as if our 23 years of marriage were worth less than what he spent on a weekend in Las Vegas. The smell of bacon began to waft through the kitchen, and it was then that I realized Jennifer had felt comfortable enough to start making breakfast. She was wearing the apron my mother had given me as a wedding gift, a blue apron with delicate embroidery that said, "Home Blessings." Seeing her wearing it was like being punched in the gut. She hummed softly as she scrambled eggs in the pan, completely oblivious to the fact that she was destroying a family, or perhaps completely aware and simply not caring. "Sarah, are you still here?" Richard asked, his voice thick with impatience. He'd sat down at the table and was checking emails on his phone, as if I were just a minor inconvenience in his perfect morning. The sound of his fingers tapping on his iPhone screen mixed with the pounding of the rain outside, creating a disturbing soundtrack to the end of my marriage. Jennifer placed a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon in front of Richard, lightly kissing the top of his head, an intimate gesture that made me realize they weren't just having an affair. They'd been living as a couple for a long time. How long? Was all I could manage to whisper, my voice hoarse and broken. Richard looked up from his phone for the first time since giving me the ultimatum. "How long what?" he asked, pretending not to understand, but I could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what I was talking about. Jennifer stopped stirring the eggs and turned to watch us, as if watching an interesting movie. "How long have you two been together?" I repeated, my voice growing firmer despite the fact that my whole world was crumbling around me. Richard sighed as if I were being dramatic, slamming the phone down on the table with more force than necessary. "That doesn't matter now, Sarah. What matters is that you need to accept reality and move on." But Jennifer, that cruel smile still plastered on her face, decided to answer for him. 2 years, she said, her voice filled with malicious satisfaction. 2 wonderful years. Richard told me you hadn't been intimate in a long time anyway. The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. 2 years. 2 years of lies, of meetings that went on late, of work trips that lasted entire weekends. The rain was falling harder now, pounding on the windows like desperate fists trying to break in. The sound was deafening, but it couldn't drown out the ringing in my ears caused by Jennifer's revelation. 2 years of betrayal. 2 years in which I had questioned my own sanity, wondering why my husband seemed so distant, why he no longer touched me, why he always found excuses not to spend time with me. Now I had my answer, served at breakfast alongside scrambled eggs and crispy bacon, seasoned with the casual cruelty of a woman who had stolen my husband and now wanted to steal my dignity too. 2 years, I repeated, letting the number echo in the kitchen that suddenly seemed too small to contain all my anger and humiliation. Richard had the decency to look at least slightly uncomfortable, shifting in his chair and avoiding my gaze. But Jennifer was beaming as if she just won a hard-fought prize. She returned to the stove, continuing to make breakfast as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just confessed that she'd spent 2 years methodically destroying my marriage. The divorce papers still sat on the table, waiting for my signature, waiting for me to legitimize my own destruction. The letters seemed to dance across the page. Through the tears I was desperately trying to hold back. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Not in my own kitchen, not in front of the woman who had spent 2 years planning this moment. I picked up the pen again, my hand trembling slightly, and for a moment I considered signing. For a moment I considered ending it all, accepting the $10,000 and leaving to start a new life at 45, homeless, without financial security, but at least with my dignity partially intact. But then something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the smell of my own coffee being brewed by another woman in my kitchen. Maybe it was the sight of my husband eating peacefully while destroying our family. Maybe it was the memory of my children, who didn't yet know that their father had decided to trade their mother for a younger version. Or maybe it was simply the pure, primal rage of a woman who had given the best years of her life to a man who now treated her like trash to be discarded. I put the pen back on the table without signing anything. "No," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than it had felt in months. "I'm not signing this." Richard stopped chewing and looked at me with an expression of disbelief. "Sarah, be reasonable. You know you have no choice." But I had a choice. I'd always had a choice. I just never realized it. Jennifer turned from the stove, her expression changing from grim satisfaction to something approaching concern. She'd underestimated my fighting ability, and now she was beginning to realize she might have awakened something better left dormant. "I'm leaving," I said, grabbing my purse and car keys, "but I'm not signing this. If you want a divorce, you're going to have to fight for it properly." Richard's expression changed from impatience to something close to panic. He knew I knew all his financial secrets, all his offshore accounts, all the accounting tricks he used to hide money from clients and the government. He knew that if I decided to fight, I could expose much more than just an extramarital affair. I walked toward the door, feeling their gazes burning into my back. At the threshold, I turned one last time. "Oh, and Jennifer," I said, my voice sweet as honey, "I hope you enjoyed breakfast, because when I'm done with you two, it'll be the last expensive meal you'll have for a long time." And with that, I walked out of my house, still legally my house, and into the still falling rain, knowing I had just declared war on the two people who had tried to destroy me. But they didn't know one thing. I had spent 23 years learning all of Richard's secrets, and now I finally had a reason to use them. I drove through the wet streets of Westchester, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the rain pounding on the Honda Civic's windshield, as if the sky were trying to warn me of the coming storm. My mind was in turmoil, processing not just the betrayal, but all the little signs I'd ignored or rationalized away over the past 2 years. The text messages he'd quickly delete when I walked into the room. The weekends he'd claim to be golfing with his partners, but come home without the tan typical of hours in the sun. The subtle feminine scent I'd sometimes smell on his clothes, which he'd always explain away by saying he'd hugged a colleague at the office. Now it all made cruel, painful sense. I pulled into the parking lot of the Starbucks on Main Street, the same place where Richard and I used to have coffee on Saturday mornings when we were young and in love. The contrast between those happy times and my current situation was so stark that I almost laughed, but the sound that came out of my throat was closer to a choked sob. I picked up my phone with trembling fingers and called Margaret Chen, my best friend since college, and more importantly, one of the best divorce lawyers in New York. If Richard wanted to play war, he had chosen the wrong woman. I was no longer the submissive Sarah who had quietly accepted everything. I was the Sarah who had discovered she had nothing to lose. "Margaret, I need you, now." The words came out in an urgent whisper as she answered the phone. I could hear the rumble of Manhattan traffic in the background, which meant she was heading to the office. "Sarah, what time is it? Are you okay?" The concern in her voice made me realize she was calling at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning. Definitely not a normal time to call a friend. Richard served me with divorce papers this morning, in front of his mistress, in my kitchen. The silence on the other end lasted only 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. That son of a bitch. Margaret never had a filter when it came to men who cheated on their wives, probably because she'd spent 15 years seeing firsthand the damage they left behind. "Where are you now?" "No, don't tell me. Come to my office, now. And Sarah? Don't sign anything at all. Don't talk to him. Don't do anything until we get there. Do you hear me?" Her voice had that professional, determined tone I knew so well. The same tone she used when she was about to destroy someone in court. For the first time in hours, I felt a spark of hope ignite in my chest. The drive to Manhattan took 2 hours because of the heavy morning traffic. 2 hours I used to mentally review everything I knew about Richard's finances. As the wife of a successful lawyer, I had access to information most divorcing women didn't. I knew about the secret Cayman Islands account he used for special investments. I knew about the suspicious payments some clients made directly to his personal accounts, bypassing the firm's official records. I knew about the Miami property registered in the name of his fictitious company, a house he never mentioned in the separation papers. Margaret's office was on the 32nd floor of a midtown building, with a stunning view of the city that normally took my breath away. But that morning, as I sat in the Italian leather chair at her mahogany desk, all I could see were the distorted reflections of the buildings in the windows, as if the city itself were fragmented and confused, just as I felt. Margaret stormed into the room wearing a black Armani suit, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her dark eyes shining with an intensity I knew well. It was the same expression she wore before winning a major case. "First tell me everything. From the beginning. Don't leave anything out." She grabbed a digital recorder and placed it on the table between us. Every word he said every facial expression, every detail about this woman. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with here. For 2 hours, I recounted every second of that horrific morning. From the moment I went downstairs to the kitchen and found Jennifer making coffee to the moment I stepped out into the rain. Margaret took notes furiously on a yellow legal pad, occasionally interrupting to ask for more details or clarification. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with those piercing eyes. You just gave me enough ammunition to blow up Richard like he was an abandoned building. She smiled. But it wasn't a gentle smile. It was the smile of a predator who'd just spotted his prey. He made at least 3 serious mistakes this morning. First, he tried to force you to sign an agreement without legal representation. That's coercion. Second, he did it in front of his mistress, publicly establishing the extramarital affair. Third, he tried to hide substantial assets in an agreement that was clearly designed to benefit him disproportionately. She paused, leafing through her notes. But now I need to know, do you just want a fair divorce, or do you want to destroy him completely? The question hung in the air between us like toxic smoke. I could smell the gourmet coffee Margaret's assistant had brought, mixed with the subtle scent of her expensive perfume and the smell of rain that still clung to my clothes. Through the window, I could see tiny people moving along the sidewalks below, going about their normal lives, unaware that on the 32nd floor, a war was being declared. I want justice, I finally said, my voice coming out firmer than I expected. He spent 2 years lying to me, 2 years making me question my own sanity. He tried to rob me this morning in front of the woman who cheated on me with him. So yes, Margaret, I want to destroy him completely. Margaret nodded as if that was exactly the answer she'd been hoping for. Perfect. Because based on what you've told me about his finances, I believe Richard isn't just an unfaithful husband. He's a criminal. And we're going to prove it. She opened a thick folder and spread documents across the table. I want you to tell me everything about these offshore accounts, about the suspicious payments, about any irregularities you've noticed over the years. No matter how small or insignificant they seem. In cases like this, the smallest details are what destroy empires. For another 3 hours, we sifted through 23 years of marriage with Richard, examining every suspicious financial transaction, every small lie that now took on a larger meaning, every moment he'd acted strangely or secretively. Margaret asked questions I never would have thought to ask, connecting dots I hadn't even known existed. When she discovered that Richard had transferred $500,000 into an account in Jennifer's name 6 months earlier, a transaction I'd questioned, and which he'd explained as an investment in an acquaintance's business. Her eyes practically lit up with delight. Sarah, your husband isn't just an adulterer. He's a money launderer. Margaret stood and began pacing the room, her mind clearly racing. Those payments from the clients you mentioned? I bet they're kickbacks or payments for illegal services. The Cayman Islands account? Tax evasion. The Miami property? Probably bought with dirty money. And now he's made the mistake of involving Jennifer directly in his finances. She stood in front of the window, staring down at the city like a general surveying a battlefield. We're not just going to win this divorce, Sarah. We're going to send Richard to prison. The realization of what Margaret was saying hit me like a punch in the gut. For 23 years, I had been married to a criminal. For 23 years, I had helped, however unwittingly, maintain the facade of respectability that allowed Richard to continue his illegal schemes. But does that mean I can also be considered an accomplice? I asked, feeling panic begin to set in. I signed joint tax returns. I knew about some of those accounts. Margaret turned to me with a reassuring expression, but her eyes still held that fierce intensity. No, Sarah. You were the deceived wife, not the criminal partner. Besides, you're cooperating with us now, which puts you in the position of a key witness, not a suspect. She returned to the table and began organizing the documents into neat stacks. But this means we need to act quickly. As soon as Richard realizes you won't sign his agreement, he'll try to hide or transfer even more assets. We need to freeze his accounts before he can do that. And we need to do it today. Margaret's phone rang, interrupting our war plans. It was her assistant, informing me that there was a man at the front desk claiming to be Sarah's husband, and that he needed to speak with her urgently. Margaret and I exchanged glances, and I could see a predatory smile forming on her lips. "Send him up," she said to the assistant, "and call security. Tell them to be on standby." She hung up the phone and turned to me. "It seems Richard has decided to accelerate our schedule. This is perfect, actually. When men like him get desperate, they make mistakes, and I have a feeling he's about to make a very big one." I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as we waited for Richard to arrive. Margaret instructed me to say nothing, just watch and let her handle everything. "He'll probably try to intimidate you, perhaps make veiled threats. Some husbands also bring their mistresses to show they've moved on. Whatever he does, remain calm and remember, he doesn't know we already know about his crimes. That's our advantage." The sound of footsteps approaching in the hallway made my stomach churn, but it also awakened something fierce inside me. Richard had underestimated the woman he'd been married to for 23 years, and now he was about to discover exactly how dearly that mistake would cost. The door opened and Richard walked in, still wearing the same impeccable suit from this morning, but now with an expression of barely concealed irritation. And, as Margaret had predicted, Jennifer was with him, now wearing a Chanel ensemble I immediately recognized. It was the same one I'd admired in the Madison Avenue store window a few weeks ago, costing over $5,000. Seeing her, wearing clothes bought with money that was technically still half mine, made my anger boil even more intensely. Richard looked around Margaret's office with an expression of barely concealed disdain, as if he was sizing up an opponent and had already decided he was inferior. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with false condescension, "you're being dramatic. There's no need to involve expensive lawyers in something we can resolve between us like civilized adults." Jennifer remained silent beside him, but her eyes studied me with a calculating intensity that made me realize she was much more than just the pretty mistress. She was a strategist. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her posture radiating the kind of authority that comes from years of destroying men, just like Richard in courtrooms across the city. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice polite but icy, "so nice to finally meet you. Sarah has told me a lot about you. So much." The silence in Margaret's office was so thick I could feel the tension vibrating in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Richard adjusted his tie with a nervous gesture I knew well. He always did it when he was trying to maintain control in a situation that was slipping out of his control. Jennifer stood beside him like a perfectly sculpted statue, but I could see her eyes darting around the room, assessing every detail, every document visible on Margaret's desk, every expression on our faces. She was smarter than Richard realized, and definitely more dangerous than I had initially thought. Margaret moved around the desk with the predatory grace of a panther, her heels making a rhythmic click on the marble floor that echoed like a countdown to destruction. "So, Mr. Patterson," Margaret said, gesturing elegantly to the chairs in front of her desk, "please be seated. I assume you've come here to discuss the terms of the separation agreement you tried to force my client to sign this morning." Richard hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with Margaret's professional and controlled tone. He was accustomed to intimidating people, especially women, and Margaret's confident posture obviously caught him off guard. Jennifer lightly touched his arm, a subtle gesture that seemed to say, "Keep control," before gracefully sitting in the offered chair. Her movements were calculated, every gesture designed to project elegance and superiority. Richard finally sat down, but not before looking directly at me with an expression that mixed irritation with something that might have been disappointment. "Sarah, you're unnecessarily complicating a situation that could be resolved amicably," he said, his voice taking on that condescending tone I'd learned to hate in the last years of our marriage. The settlement I prepared is generous considering the circumstances. $10,000 is enough for you to settle down somewhere and start a new life. Margaret laughed, a low, dangerous sound that made Richard straighten in his chair, as if physically struck. Generous? She repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Mr. Patterson, based on the financial information Sarah provided me, your net worth is in the neighborhood of $3 million. $10,000 represents approximately 3% of the total. That's not generosity, that's theft. Jennifer leaned forward slightly, her soft voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. Perhaps Mrs. Patterson should consider that after 23 years of marriage, she has contributed very little to building the family's wealth. Richard has worked tirelessly to get where he is today. The comment was delivered with a sweet smile, but the words were venomous, designed to humiliate and diminish me. For 23 years, I had supported Richard's career, raised his children, maintained his household, organized his social functions, and now this woman who had known him for only 2 years was trying to erase 2 decades of my contribution with a single cruel sentence. Margaret stood abruptly, her hands bracing the table as she leaned toward Jennifer, with an intensity that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "I'm sorry, but who exactly are you in this conversation?" she asked, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Because as far as I'm concerned, you're just the mistress who destroyed a 23-year marriage. You have no legal standing here, no right to discuss marital assets, and frankly, your presence at this meeting is a professional insult." Jennifer paled visibly, her mask of superiority slipping for a moment to reveal something more vulnerable and insecure beneath. Richard immediately shifted into a protective stance, his hand finding hers in a possessive gesture. "Jennifer has every right to be here," Richard said, his voice rising slightly in volume and pitch. "She's my partner, and any decision that affects my financial future obviously affects her as well." Margaret smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile I'd seen her use in court when she was about to deliver the final blow to an adversary. "Oh, how interesting," she said, returning to her chair with deliberately slow movements. "So you're publicly admitting that you have a serious, long-term relationship, that you make financial decisions together, that she has detailed knowledge of your assets and estate planning." Richard realized too late that he had walked into a trap, his eyes widening slightly as the implication of Margaret's words became clear. Jennifer, to her credit, quickly regained her composure. "I love Richard and he loves me. Let's not hide or be ashamed of that," she said, her voice gaining strength and conviction. "Sarah, you must accept that your marriage ended a long time ago. Richard told me you hadn't been intimate for years, that you lived like strangers in the same house. You can't blame a man for seeking happiness elsewhere when his wife has become cold and indifferent." The words hit me like slaps, each carefully chosen to wound me in my most vulnerable spot. It was true that Richard and I had grown apart in recent years, but now I understood why. He was channeling all his emotional and physical energy into Jennifer, while I blamed myself for the coldness in our relationship. The phone on Margaret's desk rang, a sharp sound that cut through the growing tension in the room. She answered with a simple yes, listened for a few seconds, and then said, "Send him up immediately." When she hung up, there was a look of deep satisfaction on her face that made me realize something important was happening. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice taking on a formal, ominous tone, "I hope you have a good criminal lawyer, because you're going to need one very soon." Richard was visibly confused, looking from Margaret to me as if we were speaking in code. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but there was a note of nervousness in his voice that hadn't been there before. The office door opened again, and 2 men in suits entered with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Margaret rose to greet them as if they were expected guests at a party. Agent Thompson, Agent Rodriguez, thank you for coming so quickly. The taller man, presumably Thompson, nodded to Margaret before turning his attention to Richard, who was now visibly pale. Mr. Richard Patterson? Thompson asked, his voice carrying the cold authority of federal law enforcement. We're from the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to ask you some questions about your recent banking transactions, particularly those involving offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The blood drained from Richard's face so quickly I thought he might faint. Jennifer grabbed his arm, her own eyes wide with fear and confusion. I don't know what you're talking about, Richard stammered, but his voice was shaky and unconvincing. Agent Rodriguez opened a folder and pulled out several photographs, spreading them out on Margaret's desk like cards in a deadly game. They were pictures of Richard entering and leaving banks, meeting men in expensive restaurants, transferring suitcases between cars. Visual documentation of years of criminal activity he thought he had kept secret. Mr. Patterson, we've been investigating your activities for 6 months, Thompson said, his voice methodically calm. Initially, we were alerted to irregularities in your tax returns. But the deeper we dug, the more we discovered. Money laundering, tax evasion, bribery of public officials, facilitating illegal financial transfers for clients involved in drug trafficking. Each accusation was delivered like a hammer, hitting a nail in the coffin of Richard's life. Jennifer instinctively backed away from him, as if her guilt were contagious, her eyes darting frantically between the agents and the compromising photographs. Margaret moved to stand beside me, her hand lightly touching my shoulder in a gesture of support. Agent Thompson, my client Sarah Patterson has been cooperating with us by providing information about her husband's suspicious activities. She was unaware of the criminal nature of these transactions and is prepared to testify as a state's witness. Richard looked at me with an expression of utter betrayal, as if I were the villain in this situation, as if I had broken some sacred code by exposing his crimes. Sarah, you don't know what you're doing, he said, his voice desperate. You're going to destroy our family. You're going to ruin Emma and Michael. How can you do this to us? The hypocrisy of his words hit me like a wave of pure rage. He had betrayed our marriage, tried to rob me financially, humiliated me in front of his mistress, and now he had the audacity to accuse me of destroying our family. I didn't destroy our family, Richard, I said, my voice calmer and more controlled than I felt. You did it the moment you decided to bring Jennifer into our home, into our bed, into our lives. You did it when you decided to steal money and break the law. I'm simply refusing to go down with you. Jennifer was now visibly shaking, probably realizing for the first time that her golden future with Richard might include visiting him in prison on weekends. Agent Rodriguez approached Richard with gleaming handcuffs in hand. Richard Patterson, you are under arrest for money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent. The reading of the Miranda rights echoed in the luxurious office like a funeral oration for the life Richard had built through lies and crimes. Jennifer began to cry, mascara tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, transforming her from an elegant, controlled woman into a pathetic, desperate figure. She tried to touch Richard as he was handcuffed, but Thompson gently but firmly intercepted her. As the agents led Richard toward the door, he turned one last time to look at me. There was so much hatred in his eyes that it made me take a step back, but there was also something else, fear. Fear of what I knew, fear of what I might reveal, fear that the woman he had underestimated for so long had finally found her power. This isn't over, Sarah, he said, his voice low and full of veiled menace. You don't know who you're messing with. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The words sent a shiver down my spine, because I knew Richard well enough to know he wasn't making empty threats. Margaret closed the door after the agents left with Richard, leaving only her, Jennifer, and me in the office, which now seemed haunted by the echoes of the confrontation that had just occurred. Jennifer sat in the chair, her sobs filling the silence like a soundtrack of destruction. He told me everything was legal. she whispered through tears. He said the offshore investments were just tax optimization strategies. He said he loved me. Margaret watched her with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. "Mrs.?" she asked, realizing we still didn't know Jennifer's last name. "Williams," Jennifer answered automatically. "Jennifer Williams. And I didn't know anything about crime. I just fell in love with the wrong man." I looked at Jennifer, really looked at her for the first time since I'd found her in my kitchen that morning. Beneath the smeared makeup and expensive clothes, she looked young and scared, like a little girl lost in a world of dangerous adults. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but then I remembered her calculated cruelty, how she'd reveled in humiliating me, how she'd methodically destroyed my marriage. "Jennifer," I said, my voice weary but firm, "you may not have known about the crimes, but you knew about me. You knew he was married, you knew he had children, you knew he was destroying a family, so don't come here pretending to be an innocent victim." Margaret nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by my ability to maintain my composure in such an emotional situation. The reality of the situation began to set in as the three of us sat in the quiet office, processing the seismic events of the last hour. Richard was arrested, his legal career ruined, and he likely faced years in federal prison. Jennifer was financially devastated, likely about to learn that all the money Richard had spent on her would have to be returned as part of her restitution. And me, I was free from the marriage that had become a sham, free from the guilt I had carried for years, believing it was my fault our relationship was failing, free to start my life over without the shadow of Richard's lies hanging over me. But freedom, I discovered, came with its own set of fears and uncertainties. The 3 weeks following Richard's arrest passed in a blur of newspaper headlines, calls from reporters, and curious glances from neighbors who had once greeted me warmly and now whispered as I passed. "Wife of prominent lawyer cooperates with FBI in money laundering case" was the headline on the front page of the Westchester Journal News, accompanied by a photo of us from the previous year at the local hospital's charity gala, both of us smiling like the perfect couple we thought we were. The irony was so bitter I could almost taste it on my tongue. Margaret had prepared me for the media coverage, but nothing could have prepared me for seeing my face on local television, identified as the wife who snitched, while reporters speculated about my motives and my private life. Emma called from college 3 days after the arrest, her voice choked with tears and confusion. "Mom, what's going on? My friends are sending me news links saying Dad was arrested. Is this true? Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding." I had to explain to my 19-year-old daughter that the man she admired, who paid her medical school tuition, who had taught her to ride a bike and drive, was a criminal. Michael was even harder. At 16, he was at the age where peer approval meant everything, and suddenly he became the kid whose dad is in prison. I found him crying in his room the night after the news spread around school, his soccer trophies reflecting the tears on his young face. The house that had once been my sanctuary had become a glass prison, with reporters camped outside and unknown cars slowly driving down the street, their occupants snapping photos through the tinted windows. I had to install blackout curtains in every ground floor room and ask Margaret to hire private security after I discovered someone trying to scale the backyard fence to take photos through the second-story windows. The constant smell of cold coffee and cigarettes from the journalists standing guard on the sidewalk seeped into the house whenever I opened a window, a constant reminder that my private life had become public entertainment. Jennifer completely disappeared from the media and public eye after Richard's arrest, like a shadow that dissipates when the lights come on. Margaret learned through her contacts that she had hired a high-profile criminal lawyer, clearly fearing she might be indicted as an accomplice in Richard's crimes. The bank account where Richard had transferred the $500,000 was frozen by the FBI, leaving Jennifer without access to the funds she likely used to maintain her lavish lifestyle. According to the records Margaret was able to obtain, Jennifer had moved back to a small apartment in Queens. a dramatic drop from a Westchester mansion to a 500-square-foot studio that cost less per month than she used to spend on a single pair of shoes. Richard's defense attorney, Harold Steinberg, a burly man with a reputation for defending impossible cases, contacted me through Margaret, trying to negotiate a reduced sentence in exchange for my refusal to testify against my husband. Mrs. Patterson, his greasy voice echoed through the phone during a three-way call that Margaret insisted on recording. Your husband is facing 25 years in federal prison. Your children will grow up without a father. Surely a devoted wife like you wouldn't want to see her family destroyed by a moment of justifiable anger. The audacity of the attempted manipulation left me speechless for a moment, but Margaret responded with the surgical precision of a razor. Mr. Steinberg, Margaret replied, her voice sharp as glass. My client is not responsible for destroying her family. Your client did that when he decided to engage in criminal activity and have an extramarital affair. Furthermore, any attempt to intimidate or manipulate a federal witness would constitute obstruction of justice, and I would not hesitate to report it to the appropriate authorities. The silence that followed was so thick that I could hear Steinberg breathing heavily on the other end of the line, clearly realizing he had underestimated both Margaret and my resolve. The call ended with a veiled threat about unintended consequences of cooperating with the federal government. Words that haunted me for days. It was during the 4th week after my arrest that things started to get truly sinister. First came the silent phone calls at 2 a.m., ringing only once before hanging up, always from the same block number. Then came the strange cars that appeared on my street, occupied by men who seemed to be watching me, but never got close enough for me to see their faces clearly. Margaret insisted I report everything to the local police and the FBI, but they said they couldn't do anything about suspicious activity that technically didn't constitute a crime. The feeling of being watched became a constant presence, a weight on my shoulders that made me look over my shoulder whenever I left the house. The final straw came one cold November morning when I found a photo of myself leaving the supermarket taped to my car's windshield with a message written on the back in red capital letters. Some people should learn when to keep quiet. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper as I called Margaret, who immediately contacted Agents Thompson and Rodriguez. They came to my house within an hour, treating the threat with a seriousness that made me realize I had become a target not only of the media, but of far more dangerous people who had a vested interest in keeping Richard's crimes buried forever. Mrs. Patterson, Agent Thompson said as he examined the photo with latex gloves, you need to understand that your husband's case goes far beyond simple tax evasion. Some of the people involved in these financial transactions are extremely dangerous. Drug dealers, members of criminal organizations, corrupt politicians. You have become a threat to them by agreeing to testify. His words made me feel like the ground was disappearing from under my feet. I had thought I was fighting for justice in a messy divorce, but suddenly I found myself at the center of a criminal network that extended far beyond Richard's law firm. Margaret suggested I consider entering the witness protection program, at least temporarily, but the idea of abandoning everything, my home, my identity, my children, felt like a victory for the people trying to silence me. No, I said with a firmness that surprised everyone, including myself. I won't hide. I won't let them intimidate me into keeping quiet about what Richard did. If I back down now, they've won, and my children will never get justice for what was stolen from them. Agent Rodriguez looked at me with an expression that mixed admiration and concern, as if he were looking at someone brave about to make a very dangerous decision. It was then that Margaret had an idea that would completely change our strategy. Sarah, she said, her eyes shining with the intensity of someone who'd just had an epiphany. What if instead of hiding from the threats, we use them against them? Every threat they make, every attempt at intimidation, is further evidence of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. They're committing new crimes in an attempt to cover up old ones. She began pacing the room, her mind clearly working in high gear. We'll document everything. Security cameras, voice recorders, GPS tracking. We'll turn you into bait that catches predators. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. Instead of being a passive victim of intimidation, I would become an active participant in capturing the very people trying to silence me. Federal agents installed surveillance equipment in my home that would be the envy of a spy movie. Microscopic cameras in the buttons of my blouse, voice recorders that looked like jewels, a GPS tracking system that could pinpoint my exact position at any moment. My home became an operations center, with monitors displaying security camera feeds and FBI technicians checking electronic equipment every morning. Emma and Michael were initially terrified when they learned of the plans, but gradually they began to understand that their mother was no longer the passive woman who had silently accepted betrayal and humiliation. "Mom, you're being very brave," Emma told me during one of our nightly calls, her voice filled with an adult admiration that made me realize my daughter had grown years in just a few weeks. Michael was more direct, as always. "Mom, are you going to catch the bad guys who hurt Dad? Or are you going to catch Dad for the crimes he committed?" The question forced me to confront a difficult truth. I still wasn't sure if I was fighting for justice or revenge. The answer came on a gray December afternoon when I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was male, rough with smoke, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "Mrs. Patterson, my name is Vincent Torino. You may have heard of me." I hadn't, but something in his tone made my blood run cold. "I represent some investors who are interested in resolving this unpleasant situation with your husband in a way that is beneficial to all involved." The words were elegant, but the underlying threat was crystal clear. He was offering me money to change my story, to disappear, to allow Richard's crimes to be buried along with the evidence. "Mr. Torino," I replied, my voice surprisingly calm, considering my heart was pounding like a jackhammer. "I think you have the wrong person. I have nothing to negotiate." His laugh was low and sinister, the sound of someone accustomed to having their offers accepted without question. "Mrs. Patterson, everyone has something to negotiate. Your children, for example. Emma is studying medicine in Boston, isn't she? A beautiful young woman walking alone across campus late at night. Michael plays football. Sports can be very dangerous. So many opportunities for accidents." The line was silent for a moment that felt like an eternity, and then he continued. "You have 48 hours to reconsider your position. We'll be in touch." When the call ended, I was shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. They weren't just threatening me. They were threatening my children, the two people in the world I loved more than my own life. For a moment I considered giving in, taking the money and disappearing, protecting Emma and Michael, even if it meant letting Richard get away with it. But then I looked around my house, decorated with family photos and mementos from 23 years of marriage, and realized that running away wouldn't protect my children. It would only make them targets for the rest of their lives. Vincent Torino had just made his own fatal mistake. He had underestimated the power of a mother protecting her children. Margaret arrived at my house within 20 minutes, bringing with her agents Thompson and Rodriguez and a fierce determination that matched my own. "Sarah," she said, as FBI technicians set up equipment to trace Torino's next call, "you've just been threatened by one of the most dangerous men on the East Coast. Vincent Torino isn't just a common criminal. He's an expert at making people disappear. But he also made a crucial mistake. He threatened you on tape. And now we have direct evidence of witness intimidation and criminal threats." Her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a predator who had found the perfect prey. "When he calls back, we'll be ready for him." Vincent Torino's second call came exactly 48 hours later, at 3 in the afternoon on a freezing Thursday, as I sat in my kitchen surrounded by federal agents and tracking equipment that transformed my home into a spy movie operations center. The phone rang with its normal, familiar ring, but the weight of the moment made each ring sound like a funeral bell. My hand shook slightly when I answered, but my voice was firm and controlled, the result of 2 days of intensive training with the agents on how to hold a conversation that could save or condemn not only my life, but the lives of my children. Agent Thompson nodded at me from the next table, where computer screens displayed sound waves and tracking signals, trying to pinpoint the origin of the call. Mrs. Patterson, Torino's gruff voice echoed through the speaker system the technicians had installed, making his presence felt in every corner of the kitchen. I hope you've used these 48 hours to carefully consider our offer. My associates were disappointed when they learned you still hadn't changed your mind about testifying against your husband. There was a calculated coldness to his words that reminded me of venomous snakes. Beautiful, mesmerizing, yet lethal. I could hear traffic noise in the background of the call, the sound of horns and engines that suggested he was calling from somewhere busy, likely trying to make it harder to track. "Mr. Torino," I replied, following the script we'd rehearsed dozens of times. "You mentioned an offer, but I didn't hear any specific offer in our last conversation, only threats." The silence that followed was thick with tension, and I could see the agents lean forward in their chairs, every muscle tense like springs ready to spring. Margaret sat beside me, her eyes fixed on my face, ready to pass on any notes or instructions that might be needed. The smell of cold coffee and overheated electronics filled the air, mixed with the subtle scent of the perfume I'd sprayed that morning, a small attempt to maintain some normalcy in a completely surreal situation. Torino laughed, a low, menacing sound that made my skin crawl. "You're right, Mrs. Patterson. Let me be more specific. $2 million, wired to an offshore account of your choosing, in exchange for your permanent silence about your husband's business activities. You take the money, change your name if you wish, and never again speak of Richard Patterson or anything related to the federal case." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air like toxic smoke. "Alternatively, you can continue being stubborn and discover how difficult it is to protect two grown children when you don't know where the danger might be coming from." The sum momentarily took my breath away. $2 million represented more money than I could earn in several lifetimes, enough to ensure Emma finished medical school debt-free and Michael had every opportunity he wanted in life. For a moment, a treacherous part of my mind whispered that perhaps this was the solution. Take the money, protect my children, and let justice take care of itself. But then I remembered the other families that had been destroyed by Richard's criminal schemes, the innocent clients who had lost their savings, and I realized that accepting that dirty money would make me as corrupt as my ex-husband. $2 million is a lot of money, I said carefully, following the agent's instructions to keep Torino talking as much as possible. "But how can I be sure you'll keep your end of the deal? And how can I be sure my children will be safe even after I accept?" Agent Rodriguez was typing furiously on his laptop, likely coordinating with other agencies to triangulate the caller's location. Occasional little beeps from the electronics punctuated our conversation like a digital soundtrack to a negotiation that could determine whether I lived or died in the next few hours. "Mrs. Patterson, you're talking to someone who has honored agreements for over 20 years, Torino replied, his voice taking on an almost insulted tone. "My word is my bond. As for your children's safety, let's just say my associates have a very long memory for people who cooperate, and an even longer memory for people who don't." The veiled threat made me feel nauseous, but it also gave me the resolve I needed to continue with the plan. "Besides," he continued, "consider this. Even if you testify, Richard will likely only be sentenced to a few years in prison. The real criminals in this situation have the resources to continue their operations from prison or elsewhere. Your cooperation with the government is a temporary inconvenience for us, but a permanent death sentence for you." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy shroud. He was right about one thing. Even if Richard were convicted, the people behind the criminal schemes would remain free, and I would become a permanent target for daring to expose their operations. But there was something in his voice, a note of urgency beneath the calculated confidence, that made me realize my cooperation with the FBI was causing more damage to his organization than he was willing to admit. Margaret slipped me a note. "He's nervous. Keep pressing. Mr. Torino, I said, putting a note of genuine consideration in my voice. I need more details about how this would work. How would the money be transferred? When? And what exactly do you expect me to do regarding my already scheduled testimony? I could see Agent Thompson smiling slightly. Each question I asked forced Torino to reveal more about his operations and methods. The sound of typing intensified around me. Technicians working to capture and analyze every word, every background noise, every clue that might lead to the location or identity of Torino's associates. The money would be transferred in installments over 6 months to several different accounts to avoid detection. Torino explained, his voice taking on the tone of a businessman discussing a legitimate contract. As for your testimony, you would simply develop selective memory loss about certain aspects of your husband's financial dealings. It's not uncommon in traumatic cases like divorces. Stress can affect memory. There was a clinical coldness to his words that made me realize he'd made this kind of arrangement many times before, that I was just another problematic witness to be bought or eliminated. It was then that I made the mistake that nearly cost me everything. In my determination to get more information, I pushed too far. What if I wanted more money? I asked, trying to sound greedy and mercenary. I mean, $2 million seems like a lot, but considering the risks I'm taking, maybe we should talk about 3 or 4 million. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It wasn't contemplative or calculating, it was dangerous. When Torino spoke again, his voice had changed completely, losing any pretense of professional civility. Miss Patterson, you're being too greedy for your own good, he said, and now there was an icy fury in his words that made everyone in the room straighten as if electrocuted. Greedy people sometimes forget that they're in very vulnerable positions. Perhaps I need to arrange a demonstration of the seriousness of our offer. The line fell silent for a terrifying moment, and then he continued, Your daughter, Emma, leaves the medical library every Tuesday at 9 o'clock. She walks alone to her dormitory along Beacon Street. It's a dangerous walk for a young woman alone in a big city. My blood ran cold instantly. He wasn't just threatening me. He was telling me that his men were watching my daughter, knew her routine, knew exactly where to find her at any given moment. The specificity of his information made me realize this wasn't a vague threat. It was a detailed plan. Agent Thompson was already speaking urgently into his radio, likely coordinating immediate protection for Emma, while Margaret scribbled furiously in her notebook. The sound of my own heartbeat seemed deafening in my ears. You're making a huge mistake, I managed to say, my voice shaking despite my efforts to keep it steady. If anything happens to my children, there will be no place on earth for you to hide. Torino laughed again, but this time it sounded genuinely amused, as if I'd told a particularly funny joke. Mrs. Patterson, you really don't understand who you're dealing with, do you? I've made people disappear on 3 continents. I have judges on my payroll, police officers who work for me, politicians who owe me favors. You're a suburban housewife who thinks she can play on the same level as professionals. Maybe, I replied, feeling a strange calm descend over me like an icy shroud. But I'm a suburban housewife with absolutely nothing to lose, and that makes me far more dangerous than you realize. It was true. Richard had already destroyed my former life, my identity, my financial security. The only ones left were my children, and if Torino threatened them, I would fight with the desperate ferocity of a cornered animal. Besides, I continued, looking directly at Agent Thompson. You just specifically threatened my daughter in a call that's being recorded by the FBI. Congratulations. You've just incriminated yourself in conspiracy to kidnap and make death threats. The silence that followed lasted exactly 15 seconds. I know because I was staring at the digital timer on the technician's computer screen. When Torino spoke again, his voice was dangerously low, filled with a fury that made his previous threats seem like child's play. Miss Patterson, you have just signed a death warrant for yourself and your family. There will be no more negotiations, no more offers. You have 24 hours to disappear from the face of the earth, or I will personally make sure you wish you had accepted my generous offer. The line went dead, leaving only the sound of whirring electronics and my own heavy breathing filling the dead silence of the kitchen. Agent Thompson immediately began speaking into his radio, calling for immediate protection for Emma and Michael, while Rodriguez coordinated with local authorities in Boston and at Michael's school. Margaret stood and began pacing the kitchen like a caged lion, her legal mind clearly processing the implications of everything we had just heard. "Sarah," she said, stopping in front of me and placing her hands on my shoulders, "you just did something extraordinarily brave and extraordinarily stupid at the same time. Torino isn't bluffing. He really will try to kill you now. But you also just gave us enough evidence to arrest him for terroristic threats, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to commit murder." The realization that I had crossed a line of no return hit me like an avalanche. There were no more negotiations, no more mind games or subtle legal maneuvers. Vincent Torino had declared open war on me and my family, and now the only option was to win or die trying. "How long do we have?" I asked, surprised by the calmness in my own voice. Thompson glanced at his watch and then back at me with a grim expression. "Based on his operational pattern, probably a few hours. He'll want to act quickly before we can fully locate and protect you and your children." "Sarah, I'm not going to lie to you. The next 48 hours are going to be the most dangerous of your life." I looked around my kitchen, now transformed into a military command center with federal agents, electronic equipment, and weapons I hadn't even known existed until a few weeks ago. Thinking back, just 3 months ago, I was a typical suburban housewife, worrying about dinners, school meetings, and whether Richard would get home in time for dinner. Now I was the target of a professional assassin, a protected federal witness, and seemingly the only person standing between Vincent Torino and his continued impunity for his crimes. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. For the first time in years, I had a clear purpose and a cause worth fighting for, even if that fight might cost me everything. The next 12 hours unfolded like a slow-motion action movie, with each passing minute bringing a new layer of tension and danger. Emma was immediately placed under police protection in Boston, with 2 federal agents disguised as students discreetly following her around campus, while others set up surveillance around her dorm. Michael was removed from school due to a family emergency and taken to an FBI safe house in Albany, a place straight out of a spy movie with bulletproof windows and a security system that cost more than most people earn in a year. The constant sound of helicopters circling our neighborhood became an ominous soundtrack to what was quickly becoming an urban war zone. My house was transformed into a fortress, with federal agents positioned at every strategic corner and armored vehicles disguised as regular cars parked along the street. Agent Thompson explained to me that Torino had a specific operating method. He liked to make his victims suffer psychologically before the final blow, using intimidation and terror to break their mental resistance. "He'll probably try some mind games first," Thompson told me as he checked the house's alarm system for the 10th time. Cars driving slowly, silent phone calls, maybe even a small show of force. The goal is to make you panic and make a mistake that allows him to get to you. Around 10 p.m., the mind games began exactly as Thompson had predicted. First came the sound of breaking glass coming from the backyard, not from our windows, but from the home of our neighbors, the Morrisons, who had been temporarily relocated to a hotel for their own safety. When officers rushed to investigate, they found all the first-floor windows shattered and a message spray-painted on the front door. "You're next." The smell of fresh paint mingled with the scent of autumn and dead leaves, creating a nauseating combination that made me realize Torino wasn't just trying to kill me. He was trying to drive me insane first. Margaret had stayed in the house with me, refusing to leave me alone, even when the agent suggested it would be safer for her to leave. "Sarah, I've known you for 25 years, she said when I tried to convince her to leave. "I'm not going to abandon you now, especially when you're doing the right thing for the first time in decades." Her words hit me like a punch because there was truth in them. For years, I had been passive in my marriage, accepting Richard's coldness, the lies, the signs of betrayal, because it was easier than confronting reality. Now, for the first time, I was fighting for something I truly believed in. Around midnight, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Torino. It was a female voice I didn't recognize, young and frightened. "Mrs. Patterson? Please don't hang up. My name is Lisa Chen. I was your husband's assistant at the law firm." My heart began to pound. Lisa was one of the few people from Richard's office I'd met in person. A brilliant 26-year-old who was studying for the bar exam at night while working during the day. "Lisa, where are you? Are you okay?" I asked, feeling a cold fear spread through my chest. "I'm hiding in a cheap hotel in New Jersey," she whispered, and she could hear the terror in her voice. "Mrs. Patterson, they've come after me. Dangerous men. They want me to tell lies about you in court, to say that you knew about Mr. Patterson's crimes, that you were involved." Her voice broke slightly. "They offered me money first, lots of money. When I refused, they showed me pictures of my family in San Francisco. My mother leaving the convenience store where she works. My father walking home from work. They know where my parents live, Mrs. Patterson. They know everything about my life." Margaret immediately signaled the agents, who began tracing Lisa's call while coordinating protection for her family in California. The extent of Torino's network was becoming frighteningly clear. Not only did he have the resources to threaten me directly, but he also had the organization to locate and intimidate anyone who might have information relevant to the case. "Lisa, you're doing the right thing by calling me," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "The federal agents will protect you and your family. You don't need to be afraid of them." "But I'm scared, Mrs. Patterson," Lisa cried. "You don't understand. They told me things about what they do to people who don't cooperate. They showed me pictures." Her voice became almost inaudible. "Mrs. Patterson, I know things about your husband's operations that even you don't know. I've seen documents. I've heard phone conversations. What you've discovered so far is just the tip of the iceberg. Richard wasn't just laundering money. He was facilitating the purchase of illegal weapons, helping war criminals hide assets, even—" She paused, clearly struggling to find the courage to continue. "Even what, Lisa?" I asked, even though I already suspected the answer would be worse than anything I'd imagined. "Human trafficking," she finally whispered. "Children, Mrs. Patterson. He was helping move money for child trafficking rings. I stumbled across the records while organizing your files. When I realized what I was seeing, I wanted to vomit. Your husband isn't just a financial criminal. He's a monster." The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. For 23 years, I had slept next to a man who not only cheated on his wife and stole from clients, but also facilitated crimes against innocent children. Margaret had to hold me up as my legs gave way. The enormity of the evil Richard had committed, the horrors he had enabled, hit me like a tsunami of nausea and horror. "Lisa, do you have these documents?" Margaret asked, taking control of the conversation as I struggled to process the revelation. "I have copies," Lisa replied. I hid them before I fled the office. I knew someone might try to silence me if they found out what I knew. Agent Thompson was now speaking urgently into his radio, clearly coordinating a rescue operation to bring Lisa to safety. It was then that the lights went out, not just in our house, but all along the street, plunging the entire neighborhood into a pitch-black darkness that seemed to engulf everything. The only sound was the hum of the FBI's emergency generators automatically turning on, providing limited power for communications and security equipment. Lisa's call abruptly cut off, leaving only the dial tone echoing in the darkness. Margaret grabbed my arm as federal agents moved through the house with tactical flashlights, their low, tense voices filling the air with orders and status updates. "This isn't an accidental power outage," Agent Thompson said, his voice laden with a controlled urgency that made my blood run cold. "Torino is escalating. He's cut power to the entire area to create cover for an approach. Everyone to defensive positions. This is the moment we've been waiting for." The sound of heavy boots moving quickly through the house mingled with the noise of weapons being readied and equipment being checked. Through the tinted windows, I could occasionally see the glow of night vision goggles moving through the trees in the backyard. Margaret led me to what the agents had designated the safe room, my own master bedroom closet, which had been reinforced with steel plates and equipped with a separate communication system. The space was cramped and claustrophobic, smelling of mothballs and the perfume I used to wear on special occasions with Richard, a wry reminder of the life I had lost forever. Sarah, no matter what happens out there, you are not leaving here until Thompson or Rodriguez come to get you personally, Margaret said, her voice firm but thick with emotion. And if anyone else comes to this door, you use this. She pressed a small but heavy pistol into my hands, the metal ice cold against my sweaty palms. The first shot rang out at 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I was looking at the digital clock on the public address system when the sound echoed through the house like thunder. It was immediately followed by a series of gunshots that seemed to come from every direction at once, creating a cacophony of violence that made the walls vibrate around me. I could hear voices shouting commands in English and languages I didn't recognize. The sound of glass shattering and the unmistakable sound of people running throughout the house. Margaret was crouched beside me in the dark closet, both of us gripping our guns with hands that trembled with both fear and adrenaline. "Sarah Patterson!" a male voice shouted from somewhere in the house, probably the first floor. It wasn't Torino. This voice was younger, with an accent that sounded Russian or perhaps Ukrainian. "We know you're here. Come out now and your death will be swift. Stay hidden and we'll make you watch your family die first." The words were delivered with a casual coldness that was somehow more terrifying than anger or emotion. This was a man for whom killing was simply a job, a task to be completed with professional efficiency. Margaret whispered something in my ear, but I couldn't process her words over the sound of my own heart beating like a war drum. Through the comm system, I could hear fragments of the agents' conversations. 3 shooters confirmed on the northern perimeter. Alpha team engaged. We need backup. Civilian targets still secure. Holding position. The realization that people were dying to protect me, that the violence happening all around was because of me, filled me with crushing guilt mixed with a fierce determination to make their sacrifices worthwhile. It was then that I heard the sound that filled me with more terror than all the gunshots, the house phone ringing. In the midst of a gunfight, with the house under siege, someone was calling the landline. Margaret and I looked at each other in the darkness, both realizing the ominous implication. Whoever was calling knew exactly what was happening in the house, which meant they had real-time information about the situation. The phone continued to ring, each sound echoing through the chaos like an omen of doom until finally it stopped, leaving only the sound of urban warfare filling the deathly silence of the night. The comm system in the closet began emitting a series of urgent beeps that cut through the sound of gunfire like emergency sirens. Agent Thompson's distorted voice echoed through the speaker. "Sarah, Margaret, can you hear me? We have a problem. Someone inside the operation is feeding information to Torino. They know our exact position, our escape routes, even the location of the safe room." His tone was controlled, but I could detect a note of panic that made my stomach churn. "You need to move now. Exit through the master bedroom window and drop down onto the garage roof. An extraction team will be waiting in the Thompsons' backyard." Margaret grabbed me by the arm, her strength surprising for a 53-year-old woman who spent most of her time behind a desk. "Sarah, come on, now!" She pushed open the closet door, and we stepped into the dark bedroom, lit only by the occasional flash of gunfire outside. The smell of gunpowder and smoke had permeated the house, mingling with the familiar scent of my perfume and the detergent I used on the linens, a surreal combination that made the situation seem even more unreal. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk, but Margaret pulled me towards the window with a determination that reminded me why she had won so many impossible cases over the years. The master bedroom window overlooked the west side of the property, where the garage roof extended like a makeshift escape platform. Margaret forced open the window, which had been jammed shut by the autumn humidity, and the cold night air rushed into the room like an icy blade. I could see dark figures moving among the trees in the backyard. Some in tactical uniforms I recognized as FBI. Others wearing dark clothing that made them disappear into the shadows like lethal ghosts. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed on the horizon, a sound that should have been comforting, but somehow filled me with more dread. How many people were dying because of me tonight? "Sarah, you need to listen to me very carefully," Margaret whispered as she helped me through the window. "If anything happens to me, if we're separated, you're going straight to the Thompson house. Don't stop, don't look back, don't try to help me. You go there and tell them everything Lisa said about the hidden documents. This information is more important than our lives. If these human trafficking rings continue to operate because you died before you could testify, your deaths will be in vain." Her words hit me like a punch. The realization that this wasn't just about my personal revenge against Richard, but about protecting innocent children who depended on my testimony to be saved. The garage roof was covered in wet leaves, making every step treacherous. I could feel the shingles sliding beneath my feet as Margaret and I moved as quietly as possible toward the edge where we could climb down into the neighbor's yard. The sound of gunfire had become more sporadic but closer, suggesting the attackers were gaining ground. Through the Thompsons' kitchen windows, I could see moving lights, flashlights or perhaps night vision goggles, indicating the extraction team was already in position. That's when I heard my name being shouted from inside my own house. Sarah Patterson." The voice was female, young, desperate, and completely familiar. It was Jennifer. The woman who had destroyed my marriage was now in my house, in the middle of a gunfight, screaming my name as if her life depended on it. Margaret and I stopped in the middle of the roof, looking at each other with confusion that quickly turned to horror as we realized the implications. "Sarah, please. They've kidnapped me. They're using me as bait. Don't let them kill me because of his crimes." Margaret shook her head violently, whispering, "It's a trap," through gritted teeth. But there was something in Jennifer's voice, a pure, desperate terror that was impossible to fake convincingly. I'd spent years listening to Richard's calculated lies. I knew what dishonesty sounded like, and this wasn't it. Jennifer was genuinely terrified, likely being used as human bait to force me out of hiding. "They said they'll kill me if you don't show up in 2 minutes. Her voice echoed again, now broken by sobs that echoed through the open windows of my house. "Sarah, no!" Margaret grabbed me as I began to move toward the edge of the roof. "You can't save everyone. Jennifer made her choice when she decided to destroy her marriage. Don't let the guilt kill her now." But as she spoke, I could hear Jennifer screaming again, this time describing in graphic detail what Torino's men were doing to her. The descriptions were so vivid and horrific that they made me feel physically ill. Margaret was right about Jennifer making her choices. But that didn't mean she deserved to be tortured to death by criminals who were using her as a pawn in their sadistic games. The sound of heavy footsteps on the garage roof made me spin around. 3 figures dressed in black were approaching us from the opposite end of the roof, their coordinated professional movements suggesting military or paramilitary training. They had found our escape route and were now trapping us between them and a 10-foot drop to the Thompsons' yard. Margaret raised her gun, but I could see in her eyes that she knew we were outnumbered and outtrained. "Sarah," she whispered, "when I start shooting, you jump. It doesn't matter if I follow you or not. You jump and run." "Margaret, no," I began, but she was already moving, firing toward the attackers while yelling at me to run. The sound of her pistol was deafening in the cold night air, mixed with the echo of return fire that sent shards of roof tiles flying around us like dangerous hail. I felt something warm and wet splatter my face. Blood, though I couldn't tell if it was mine, Margaret's, or one of the attackers. The world shrank to fragmented moments. The flash of guns, the smell of gunpowder and fear. The sound of Margaret screaming my name as I staggered toward the edge of the roof. I jumped without thinking, momentarily feeling the terrifying sensation of falling into nothingness before landing heavily on the Thompsons' wet lawn. The pain shooting through my left leg suggested at least a sprained ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, I could hear Margaret still shooting, her voice shouting challenges in profanities I'd never heard from her refined mouth. 2 federal agents appeared from the shadows beside me, lifting me by the arms and pulling me toward an armored vehicle waiting in the Thompsons' driveway. "Where's Margaret?" I screamed as they shoved me into the vehicle, but the grim expression on their faces told me everything I needed to know. The gunfire from the roof had stopped, leaving only an ominous silence that was somehow worse than all the violence that had preceded. Margaret, my best friend for 25 years, the woman who had risked her own life to help me find justice, had given her life to give me a few extra seconds of escape. The guilt and rage I felt in that moment were so intense I thought my heart would burst. The armored vehicle sped through the suburban streets like a guided missile, its tires screeching around every curve. As we headed toward a destination the agents refused to reveal for security reasons. Through the armored windows, I could see my neighborhood, the place where I had lived for 15 years, where I had raised my children, where I had believed it was safe, transformed into a war zone. Police cars with flashing lights blocked several streets, ambulances were parked on corners, and I could see bodies covered in sheets being carried out on stretchers. How many people had died tonight because of the secrets I had chosen to expose? It was during this desperate race through familiar streets turned into battlefields that my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something told me to answer. The voice on the other end was Torino's, but different, no longer controlled and threatening, now filled with a fury that seemed almost demented. "Miss Patterson, you just cost my organization dearly. 3 of my best men are dead. The police have evidence that will take years to bury, and you're still breathing when you should have been dead hours ago." His voice was hoarse, as if he'd been screaming for hours, and I could hear sirens in the background of his call. "Vincent," I said, deliberately using his first name to further irritate him. "It seems you underestimated a simple suburban housewife. Margaret is dead because of you. Federal agents are dead because of you, and you still haven't managed to silence me. Maybe you're not as professional as you thought." My own voice surprised me, cold, calculating, charged with a fury I hadn't known I possessed. The agents in the vehicle looked at me with expressions of shock and awe, clearly not expecting the witness they were protecting to actively provoke the killer trying to kill her. Torino laughed, but it was the sound of a man losing his sanity. "You want to play games, Mrs. Patterson? Let's play games. Jennifer is dead. I personally slit her throat after you refused to surrender to save her. Your lawyer friend is dead. I watched my men blow her brains out through the roof. And before dawn, your children will be dead too. Emma first. My men in Boston are already on their way to her dorm. Then Michael. The boy won't even know what hit him." Each word was delivered with a casual cruelty that made me realize Torino had crossed the line from sociopathy to something much darker and more dangerous. "You made a mistake, Vincent," I said, feeling a strange calm descend over me, despite the absolute terror his words evoked. "You just told me exactly where you are. I can hear NYPD sirens in the background of your call. You're close enough to the city to hear traffic, and your voice echoes as if it were in a large, empty building. Besides," I paused, looking at the agents who were gesturing frantically into their radios, "this call is being tracked in real time by the FBI. You have about 10 minutes before they reach your location." The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, I could feel the power shifting between us like a deadly electrical current. When Torino spoke again, his voice had changed completely. No longer the uncontrolled fury, but something far more dangerous. The calculated coldness of a cornered predator with nothing left to lose. "Mrs. Patterson, if I'm going to be arrested tonight, I'm going to make sure you watch your family die first. My men have orders to kill Emma and Michael at 5 in the morning, no matter what happens to me. The only way to save them is for you to show up in Brooklyn's warehouse district within the hour, alone, unarmed, ready to die in their place." The call cut off, leaving only the sound of distant sirens and my own heart beating like a war drum in the deathly silence of the armored vehicle. Brooklyn's warehouse, District at 4 in the morning was a maze of shadows and echoes, where every sound seemed amplified by the industrial architecture of abandoned buildings and empty streets. I was alone, as Torino had demanded, but not unarmed. The federal agents had insisted on equipping me with a nearly invisible bulletproof vest under my jacket and a microscopic transmitter that would allow them to track my exact location. The salty smell of the nearby port mingled with the aroma of diesel oil and rusted metal, creating an atmosphere that seemed straight out of an industrial nightmare. My footsteps echoed against the wet asphalt as I walked down the designated street, each step bringing me closer to what could be my last moments alive. The warehouse Torino had chosen for our final confrontation was a monster of red brick and broken windows that rose against the dark sky like a Gothic cathedral, dedicated to urban abandonment. I could see faint light leaking through a few third-floor windows, the only sign of life in a building that seemed forgotten by time. My phone vibrated, a text message from an unknown number. 3rd floor west door. Come alone or your children die in 5 minutes. The casual coldness of the threat made me pause for a moment, taking a deep breath of the chilly early morning air before pushing open the heavy metal door that creaked like the gates of hell opening. The staircase echoed with footsteps and heavy breathing, each metal step making a sound that reverberated through the empty building like pistol shots. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, I realized, but from a combination of adrenaline and pure rage that had built over months of discovering Richard's betrayal, weeks of death threats, and hours of violence that had cost Margaret and Jennifer their lives. When I reached the 3rd floor, I could hear voices coming from a large room at the end of the hallway. Torino speaking to someone in a language that sounded Russian, his words punctuated by occasional laughter that made me realize he was enjoying this final hunt. The living room door was ajar, leaking yellowish light that created a golden rectangle in the dark hallway. I took a deep breath, placed my hand on the pistol grip hidden under my jacket. Yes, I had lied about being unarmed, a lesson I'd learned from the mistakes of excessive honesty over the past few months, and pushed the door open. The scene before me was something out of a gangster movie. Torino seated behind a makeshift table made of wooden boxes. 3 armed men strategically positioned around the room, and in the far corner, tied to metal chairs, were Emma and Michael. My children were alive but visibly terrified, with duct tape covering their mouths and tears glistening on their young faces. Sarah Patterson, Torino said, rising from his chair with the exaggerated courtesy of a host welcoming guests to dinner. How punctual! I admired that in a businesswoman, and you, my dear, have proven yourself to be a far more astute businesswoman than any of us imagined. He was shorter than I'd imagined, maybe 5'7" with slicked back gray hair and a suit that cost more than most people earn in a year. But his eyes were what caught my attention, completely void of any human warmth, like staring into black holes where a soul should be. Let my children go, I said, my voice firmer than I expected, considering I was face to face with a man who had killed people on 3 continents. You want me, you have me. They have nothing to do with their father's crimes or my decision to cooperate with the FBI. Torino smiled, but it was the kind of smile venomous snakes would smile if they could. Beautiful on the surface, deadly beneath. Ah, but they have everything to do with this, dear Sarah. They are your motivation, your weakness, the reason you've made such reckless choices these past few weeks. He began to pace around the table, his hands gesturing elegantly as he spoke, as if he were giving a university lecture. You see, I've spent a lot of time studying you, Sarah Patterson. A devoted homemaker for 23 years, a devoted mother, a woman who put her family's needs above her own for decades. And then, one October morning, you discovered that the man you loved was not only cheating on you, but trying to steal from you, and something inside you broke. His words struck me with surgical precision because they were true. I had broken that morning, but not in the way he thought. I didn't break, Vincent, she said, using his first name again to establish that she wasn't intimidated by his presence. I woke up, After years of being passive, accepting lies, allowing others to control my life, I finally found my strength. And that strength has led me here, face to face with you, ready to end this once and for all. She could see in her men's eyes that they hadn't expected this level of defiance from a simple housewife. Torino stopped walking, his expression shifting slightly from condescending amusement to something approaching professional respect. "Interesting," he said, returning to his makeshift chair. "Very well, Sarah. Do you want to finish this? Let's finish it. Your children live if you die, or you all die if you try some heroic trick. Simple choice." He gestured to one of his men, who approached Emma with a knife that gleamed in the dim light. "You have 30 seconds to decide. After that, we'll start cutting up your daughter until you beg to die in her place." The terror in Emma's eyes broke my heart, but it also awakened something primal and fierce I hadn't known I possessed. The absolute protective instinct of a threatened mother. It was then that I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Helicopters approaching. Not just one, but several. The sound of their blades cutting through the air growing louder by the second. Torino heard it too, his head turning toward the broken windows with an expression of fury and disbelief. "Impossible," he muttered. "You said you came alone." I smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a genuine smile of triumph. "I came alone, Vincent. But I never said I'd be alone. Did you really think the FBI would send me here without backup? That they'd risk losing their key witness in a suicide solo operation? The sound of ropes being thrown through the broken windows echoed through the room like whips, followed by the unmistakable thud of military boots rappelling down the building's outer walls. Torino pulled a pistol from his jacket, but before he could point it at me, I was already moving. Months of fear, weeks of training with federal agents, and years of pent-up rage combined in a moment of absolute clarity. I pulled my own gun and shot, not to kill, but to incapacitate, in the right leg. Just as the agents had taught me, Torino fell screaming, his pistol flying through the air as his hands clutched the bleeding wound in his thigh. His men tried to fight back, but the windows exploded in cascades of glass as FBI agents burst into the room like avenging furies in black. The sound of automatic gunfire filled the air for exactly 17 seconds. I know because I was counting, a panic control technique Margaret had taught me weeks ago. When silence returned, Torino's 3 henchmen were on the ground, and federal agents were untying Emma and Michael, while others administered first aid to Torino, who was shouting a mixture of obscenities and threats in 3 different languages. Emma and Michael ran into my arms like children again, and for a moment I completely forgot where we were. All that mattered was that my children were alive, that they were safe, that this nightmarish journey was finally over. "Mom," Emma whispered in my ear, her voice hoarse from hours of duct tape over her mouth. "I knew you would come. I told Michael our mother would never abandon us." Michael, normally the strong, stoic son, was crying openly, his tears mingling with mine as we held each other amidst the chaos of a successful federal operation. Agent Thompson approached as paramedics carried Torino out on a stretcher, the criminal still conscious and spewing threats. "Sarah," Thompson said, his voice thick with an admiration I'd never heard from a federal agent before. "You just helped bring down one of the largest organized crime rings on the East Coast. The documents Lisa hid, combined with your testimony and the evidence we collected tonight, will send at least 15 people to prison for decades, including your ex-husband, who is now facing human trafficking charges on top of everything else." 6 months later, I sat in the gallery of a federal courthouse in Manhattan, watching Richard receive a sentence of 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He had aged years in months. His hair was completely gray, his face had lines that hadn't been there before, and his eyes had lost all that arrogance I knew so well. As the sentence was read, he looked at me one last time across the courtroom. There was no longer anger in his eyes, only utter defeat and maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of regret for the man he could have been. Torino had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, found guilty of 17 charges including conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, and running a criminal organization. During his trial, he tried to intimidate me one last time, shouting threats across the courtroom until he was removed by officers. But his words no longer affected me. I had found a strength I didn't know I possessed, a courage forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered in the violence of survival. Emma graduated from medical school with honors and now works at a hospital in Boston, specializing in helping victims of human trafficking. A career choice, she says, was inspired by the courage she saw in me during the darkest months of our lives. Michael received a full scholarship to Stanford and is studying law, determined to follow in Margaret's footsteps in fighting for justice for people who cannot fight for themselves. They visit me whenever they can, and our family, though scarred by trauma, is stronger and more united than it ever was during the years with Richard. Today, I live in a small house in Vermont, far from the chaos of Westchester and the painful memories of a life I thought I knew. I work as a counselor for women going through difficult divorces, helping them find the strength it took me decades to discover within myself. Margaret didn't live to see the justice she helped make possible, but I established a foundation in her name that provides free legal representation to wives of men involved in financial crimes. It's a small way to honor the memory of the woman who died to save me. Every night before I go to sleep, I think about that October morning when Richard handed me the divorce papers in my own kitchen, Jennifer by his side like a trophy of his betrayal. He told me to go away, thinking I would accept $10,000 and quietly disappear from his life. He completely underestimated the power of a woman who has nothing left to lose but her dignity, and who refuses to lose even that. I didn't sign the paper he wanted. Instead, I signed the paper that ruined them all, a detailed confession to the FBI that exposed decades of crimes and saved countless innocent victims. And so my story ends, not with the revenge I initially sought, but with the justice I never thought possible. Richard is in prison for the rest of his life, paying for crimes that go far beyond simple marital infidelity. Torino and his organization were destroyed, their human trafficking operations dismantled, their victims freed and receiving treatment. Margaret died a heroine, Jennifer died a victim of her own greed, and me, I lived to tell the tale, to serve as proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the right people win in the end. My name is Sarah Patterson, and this is the story of how an ordinary suburban housewife became the woman who destroyed a criminal empire, all because she refused to sign the wrong paper